It's 1 o'clock on Thursday, and here we are at the Birmingham Museum, bringing you back into our museum. Thanks for checking in. Today, our topic is going to be some things that we've noticed about how museums have changed in the last decade plus, and maybe some things that are on our minds today. Donna and I, Donna Casaceli is with me. I'm Leslie Pielack, I'm the director here. And I have to admit, I've been kicking around the field for a while now. I've seen quite a bit of other museums, and I have a couple of thoughts about where I think museums have come the last few years and where they might be going. And then when you layer that with our current pandemic, we have a whole different picture. So we thought that might be worth just kind of teasing out a little bit about how we feel about it. And I should say too that we're going to represent our points of view, our experience. Everyone's being different. I hope that's obvious, but I guess it should be said that this is just our opinion. So Donna, maybe you could start by saying how you got into the field.
Well, I started at the University of Michigan under Dr. Casaceli. My first introduction was doing an internship at the Soviet Research Center. And that was a lot of...
There's a date for you.
I'm dating myself. At the Soviet Research Center, and we were doing a lot of microfiche on the old click, 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 click. Computers and the internet were just coming around, but a lot of stuff was still, if you needed something from the library, you went to the library. So you had to have a lot of good connections, personal connections. And Dr. Casaceli was very helpful in bringing those about. And then I started, my first job was at the Henry Ford Museum, Greenfield Village, and it was the Christmas program, doing hands-on with the kids, which I absolutely loved. It was tons of fun. And then I transferred from that into the village as a third-person interpreter at several of the buildings inside the village.
So the stuff we think of now as living history.
Right.
You're in costume, you're interacting with people, you're demonstrating how things were done with the real artifacts or a reproduction of it. Yeah.
Yes. We were lucky. We had some great researchers who did a lot of work into finding out exactly how things were done. Most of everything was laid out for us, but we were third person, it's still third person. And there's a lot of difference between first person and third person.
So how do you mean first and third? Like, I'm not sure.
A lot of museums, when they first started doing these process demonstrations, were in first person, meaning they took on a character and they could not break from this character. I remember as a kid going to a museum, one of these little places, and getting very frustrated because I did not know how to ask the right questions to get the answers, because the people, well, what's a refrigerator? You know, it's like, well, where's your refrigerator? How do you know, I don't see your refrigerator. Well, it's a refrigerator. And then you get frustrated, and I think as a kid it was very disappointing for me. But that has changed a lot, and by the time I started doing it, we were third person. That means you're showing how it's done and everything, but if a child comes up and says, where's your refrigerator? You can kind of say, well, I know what a refrigerator is, but at this time period, people didn't have them. They weren't invented yet. So we used a food safe. You could answer that child's question without them feeling frustrated or trying to search for a way to ask the correct question to get the answer. And I know that was one of the biggest changes from when I was little to when I started. And I really, really liked doing the third person.
I bet, because you could picture yourself being that child. And that's part of it, I think, one of the, I should first say that I got into the museum field as my second career. So my first career, which I still actually have a small practice in mental health counseling, I was real interested, I always have been, in art and art history, so I went back for a graduate degree, and I got involved in one of the most architecturally significant early 20th century estates that you've never heard of, because private hands. It's not open to the public, and it's the William E. Scripps estate, which is in the Orion Township area. So I got involved there, and I came at it like a lot of people did, which is, at the time, the architecture itself was so interesting, it was beautiful, and it was exceptional, and it was super unusual. And it was exemplary of fine art and architecture in early 20th century America. So, I was enthralled. So when we began to open to the public a little bit, although it's not open anymore to the public, at the time and for a few years we were, that was what I thought really mattered, explain how important this building is, explain why these decorative finishes are unique, where they come from. And what happened is that people coming through the building would yeah, that's real nice, but tell us about the people, tell us about the family, what happened to them, where are they, why don't they live here anymore? And so our docents would start telling the best they could, and I would get really frustrated because they would get it wrong, and I would want them to redirect it back to, the architecture. Well, that was a learning curve for me, because just because I was enthralled with that, I wasn't picking up that as nice as all that is, it's the stories of the people that matter. So I can say that I've finally come on board, and I too now actually think that it's the people that matter, not the objects. At least in terms of emphasis, So, I guess I would say here that we have inherited the Victorian approach to museums. It's a normal evolution, I think. The Victorians, prior to the Victorian era, there really were no public museums to speak of. There were private collections, and those private collections were wealthy people who had all of the money and the ability to collect these things and then keep them for themselves. So the one thing that the Victorians did, which was great, is, hey, let's take that to the people. But what it established that we're still, I think we have some traces of, is this large institution with all these fine objects that are extremely valuable and unusual. And the, hey, we're going to show it to you and you will be enlightened approach, which comes out of the Victorian era. And honestly, I think that what we've learned is that as important as those large institutions are, small institutions like ours are really excellent at telling stories, especially local stories about everyday people. And I think that more and more we see that, yeah, George Washington's kind of interesting, but let's talk about the slaves that George Washington had on his plantation. Now we're getting into things that are stories about people that we can relate to on a personal level a little bit differently than some, lofty hero that, is bigger than life. So in my mind, I think that in general, museums are more about public history, the interpretation of this body of knowledge for public use to make it relevant, to make it meaningful. If we can't make it meaningful for that little boy who's asking, why don't you have a refrigerator, we just haven't done anything. If anything, we've distanced that person from what could have been a really important experience in some way, even at his level.
And I think that is true with schools too. Schools teach history at this person did this on this date. This person did this on this date. And it's a lot of memorization. But who was this person? What was their private life like? Where did they live? What did they do? Did they write? Did they get married? Did they have kids? And I think that, I know when I was in high school, you would have never caught me in a history class in college. I had to take one class and it was witchcraft and that was like, okay, well now this is fascinating. Because we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about people who maybe lived on the outskirts and, they were brought to prominence because of the idea of witchcraft. But that really sparked an interest in it for me personally, then I'm in the history field all of a sudden. So I've always been more of the stories. I love the stories. I love the objects if they can tell a story with it.
There you go, right.
Right, if it's a bowl, it's a bowl, it's a bowl, it's a bowl, it's not a big deal. But if it was hand carved by somebody and used to make bread and to sustain a family, and who was this family? That's what I've always...
So you were talking about technology, referencing technology a little bit. I bet you have an opinion about that.
I love Ancestry.com. I will, any of the family search is great too. But what that technology brought to people, for the longest time, your stories were only your stories. It was what your grandmother told you. And you couldn't really verify if she was right or wrong. But places like, these search engines that can bring you your World War I grandfather's service records. You can find out where they lived. What's really great is some of these actually have diaries on them. Some of them have books that were written about that personal family going back to the 1600s with anecdotes and, my family, family history says this, that, and the other. And you can really go deep into your own family history and you can really learn about the personal, the family stories that were not touchable. So now people are coming into museums with this idea, well, my grandmother used a spinning wheel, and I see a spinning wheel here, it has more, so we want to tell that story of who might have used this spinning wheel, instead of, this is a spinning wheel, it's spun wool. And
it's made out of maple.
It's just like, but this would have been used by the pioneer women in Birmingham, like the Prindle sisters. And what would life be like for the Prindle sisters that evolved around all these tools that you see, instead of this is just a tool, a tool, a tool, a tool.
Right. And the other interesting thing I think that has happened with Ancestry.com and those kind of search tools is people discovering to their, in an unexpected way, oh, there's another whole side of my family I didn't know about because of some, family scandal or whatever. But as much as that could be upsetting, I think it really opens a lot of doors. And actually the personal comes across. Also, my great-grandfather, wasn't this pillar of the community because he had this second family, but it also kind of humanizes him. So that's one of the things I think, humanizing our experience, whether we're talking about 300 years ago or whether we're talking about today, like what is that personal experience like, and how can we make it all acceptable? It's all acceptable because we're all human beings. And I think local history museums can do that because we're smaller, maybe because we have our collections tend to be more personal, because we have diaries, we have documents, we have things that we find historically valuable that a lot of big institutions really might not, because they're not associated with famous people, for example. You worked with a couple of documents recently like that.
They were from a donation, and they were written to Rhoda Bingham, who would end up marrying Hiram Daniels, who was one of the first settlers here in the Birmingham area. And they were written to her by her grandfather. And it really, if you look and really read the letters, you can see through those letters and even the letters that she wrote to other people, the views that were about women. He was a Puritan minister, and the views on women were very harsh.
They were born sinners, for example, right?
And if they lost a child, it was because they were not pleasing to God. Not that the child was sick or that there was a rampant pandemic going on. It was you were just a bad person to God. And so you see how women are viewed through these letters. Yes, they're personal, but you kind of get a wider, better understanding personally about these people.
And you see it in the writing, the literally the handwriting communicates their personality, the word choices. We were paraphrasing all the time when we were telling these stories, but whenever possible, when we can show how a document is worded, I get, anyway, a real sense of how that person's mind works. And I know Caitlin Donnelly, our other museum assistant here, who is running the camera, has definitely got to know another one of the characters in our collection, who is Martha Blakesley, based on her scrapbook, the kinds of things that she collected, and Caitlin talked about that in one of our previous programs. You know, you get insight into these people, and talk about bringing someone alive. They're the jokes that they like, or, you know, maybe not the formalities of what they wore to their wedding, because that doesn't tell you a lot about their personality, but when you read a letter or a diary entry.
Yeah, it's like for the longest time, scrapbooks were just labeled scrapbook, put in a box, shoved on a shelf.
A nightmare to conserve, how to store this thing.
And now scrapbooks are looked at as a treasure trove, because I know Caitlin is doing, she loves the Martha Blakesley, especially because of Beat Parrot. But one of my favorite scrapbooks that I've been going through is Mary Utter, and you know, she was such a very interesting, fascinating person, and you really get to know her through her scrapbook. And actually, I had to print it out and put it up, but I have one of her very first cat memes. It's a cat that she felt important enough to, it's a picture, and it's actually a postcard, and it has Lady Disdain at the bottom, and this cat looking very angry, and just like, okay, she was collecting cat memes in 1901.
You're bringing up a great point, because what we think of as a modern concept, like a meme, is really not that modern. It just has a modern name and a modern way to present it. But I mean, I think people have always looked for those ways of communicating something in a very clever way, or very to communicate to just a group of people who all sort of are in the know, and they know what that means, and isn't that clever, and that's what trends have been. And you know, whether we're talking about dance trends, or we're talking about the other strange things, which hopefully we will get to, like some of the weird things that Victorians got into and that became a thing, you know.
And that's where local museums come into play,
Right,
versus
exactly.
the larger institutions. We can preserve those local newspaper articles that have little gossip columns about what Martha Baldwin did and what Mary Utter did, and you know, the eccentrics and the Washingtonians and their little groups. And that's why I think our type of museum is just as important as these big institutions holding these artifacts, because we're preserving the personal, the people, and how they felt, and how they loved, and how they lived, and how they mourned.
And it doesn't mean that large institutions aren't doing that. A lot of times they have these fabulous audio collections and really unusual kinds of artifacts that also do that. But I think that their missions tend to be broader, of course, bigger, and they're trying to meet the needs of a very different audience than a local history museum. So we have, you know, we can do some things that I'm not sure that they can really put resources in when it comes to the kind of storytelling we might do. But I do think, too, that there are a lot of, like, variations or metaphoric ways that people communicated that we're still doing a version of today. Like, I like to say that the postcard craze of the early late 1890s to the early 1920s, let's say, especially people would take real picture postcards and then they would stamp them and send them off to people. And we have quite a few of those in our collection. It reminds me, I mean, it's really just an early version of Facebook. It's really just, hey, or maybe Instagram is even a better example. Here's a photo, it tells you a lot, I'll put a few notes on it and I'm going to send it to you, and it gives you like an insight into something I was thinking about.
Yeah.
So we've got some modern day dilemmas, we've got some modern problems You know, I think everyone is kind of tired of hearing COVID, but I have to say it because that's what I'm referring to. You know, we've been talking a lot here at the museum about not just how we tell stories from the past, but how are we collecting information about the present too. We're not, you know, unusual that way. Other museums are doing this too. But actually, Donna and I individually were thinking about this, and on the same day that I thought, you know, we ought to start collecting this stuff, Donna walks across the hall to me, to my door, and says, you know, I think we ought to start collecting this stuff. So, but I'm going to let you tell that story.
So, when I've always thought of as history, it's always foreign, far away. It happened a long time ago. But that was, I think, a concept, because we don't really have a lot of stuff that Victorians saved about themselves. I mean, they wrote about it in the newspapers and stuff, but they didn't save contemporary things themselves. A lot of stuff that comes to us, like diaries and stuff, were found in attics. Somebody wasn't going out trying to procure this. But today we realize, well, in 50 years, this is going to be history. You know, this is going to be history. Yeah, we hope. But, and if we start preserving things now for the future, then we kind of make their job a little bit easier. They won't have to go hunting for it. And a lot of things, too, are electronic that we're collecting, like all of the mayor's speeches. Well, that's a video. How are we going to preserve those? Yes, there's ways of preserving them, but we don't know if that's going to last. So we print out those speeches on acid-free paper, and we put them in a file. And but yeah, we decided kind of at the same time that this is history in the making. Whether good or bad, it's history in the making.
So to those future researchers that just want to know what exactly happened in Birmingham during the COVID pandemic, we're going to have it, and we're going to have a cache of information, and you will just be able to research your hearts out. So welcome back in 50 years.
And you're welcome.
Well, anything else you want to add about this whole concept of how museums have changed, or?
I think that going forward, I think things are going to keep changing. We do have the formats like, well, this video, where we can discuss different things. We can ask questions of our audience. I think social platforms are changing how museums are collecting information on people, but we're also capable of reaching out and collecting more objects too. So I think as museums go forward, they're going to have to institute social media into their programs. Or, you know, unfortunately, it may not end up very well for them. At times like these, you can't be forgotten.
I think you're right. I totally believe, I don't think this is, you know, earth-shattering, but museums are already changing now, and they are going to change. And the more nimble the institution is toward making those adaptations and kind of thinking ahead of the wave, because unfortunately, many museums being closed right now are still in crisis mode. It's really hard to plan when you're in crisis mode. It's hard to take advantage of opportunities when you can't be creative yet. However, I mean, so I guess I would say that this is when museums are really going to be at their best, and they might actually be at their worst. But 1 year from now, I believe we're all going to be doing things quite differently, and I hope we're collaborating more. I hope that large institutions and small institutions are partnering more. I hope we're working with other organizations in the community so we can meet needs virtually, because we're going to have to be out there, and virtual means a lot more. Coming up with great creative ideas so we can communicate, but I believe all along the best goal is always going to be to connect. As long as we can find a way to connect with people, as long as we can find a way to get across to them so they have a personal experience of our collection, I think we will be succeeding as an institution.
I agree.
How'd you
Yeah. and just reaching out to younger people. They're the ones that are going to carry this forward. They're the ones that have that connection to the future. So I think if we're going to survive, if museums are going to survive, we need to listen. What do people want?
I have this. I got an email the other day from one of our teenage students who worked with us, who has asked if he could do a virtual internship. So he gave it a name and everything. So we're going to figure that out.
We're going to move forward with it. It was his idea. It was a great idea because Leslie shared the email with all of us, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's wonderful. I mean, because then that opens it up to so many more students that can carry this forward into the future.
Yep, we'll probably have to tap his brain. So I think we're ready to wind down here. If you have comments or questions now, or after you do this, if it's after the fact, make sure and post them, because Caitlin, Donnelly, or one of us will get back to you the best we can. And tune in next Thursday at 1 o'clock. We'll have some other program focusing on something else. I don't know if we know yet, but we will come up with something.
If you have any suggestions on what you'd like to hear, any suggestions on what you want to know more about, send them to Facebook.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.